for having me here today, this morning to be with you. So I will get started. A lot of what I'll be talking about today comes from my understanding as an Indigenous woman, but also a librarian, being able to work in Canada's only Indigenous focused academic library. And I think I have a lot of privilege in being able to work at Xwi7xwa and a lot of support behind me to explore different areas of libraries and where Indigenous sovereignty fits into them, and how we are expanding our knowledges in libraries to work better with our Indigenous community members, staff, colleagues, things like that. So we'll get started. I'll share my screen, and occasionally I'll bounce in and out of my screen just to show some also websites that we have, things like that, to kind of help you and to do some more learning after. Okay. So share, perfect. Okay. Sorry about this. Okay, perfect. Okay, so today, kind of the basis of my talk is going to be talking about Indigenous data, knowledge, and cultural sovereignty, and how it fits into libraries and how it relates to libraries. So just wanted to start off by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam Nation on what's also known as Point Grey. I'm joining today from UBC Vancouver, which is where I work and live here. And I'm very happy to join. And for everyone also in the chat, if you want, or later, just think about and acknowledge the host nations that you're living on and how we act respectfully with the lands that we're on as well. So when we start kind of presentations, or when I start presentations, I always like to position or locate myself. It's one of those things that when we locate ourselves and position ourselves, it helps us to connect to our people, our stories, and acts as a powerful form of resistance and the basic building blocks of having deep relationships with one another. So when I locate myself, and other people do this in very different ways when they're meeting each other, but when I locate myself in a more formal sense, I'll often introduce who my kin are. And so talking about my family, where I come from, talking about the lands that I'm connected to, so where I'm from, and then also thinking about who I'm accountable to, and then who I'm accountable to on the lands that I reside on now. So often when I introduce myself, I like to introduce myself as, hi, I'm Kayla. I am Métis and Ukrainian, Métis on my mom's side, Ukrainian settler on my dad's side. I'm House, Favel, Grant, Spence, and Moroso. I'm originally from Amiskwachee, also known as the Beaver Hills in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. I live currently on the traditional and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam Nation, and I live here, work here, and thank them every day for continuing to allow me to be here and for me to be able to be building relationships with folks from Musqueam. So when we do this, it helps to acknowledge our biases, our positions, and our connections, and to build a more trustful relationship with one another. And also when I ask questions like, who are you connected to? So what lands are you connected to? It's not always thinking specifically geographically. There's in some cases when I'm asking who you're connected to or what your kin connections are, it's thinking more about, from an Indigenous worldview, where your umbilical cord is connected to. So when we're speaking in Cree or Nahiawean and we're asking where we're connected to, it literally is asking where our umbilical cords connect. Who are our matriarchs? Who are our family? So that's a little bit about my perspective on a little bit about where I come from, as well as you get to know what worldviews influence me. So that Cree Treaty 6 Métis worldview that influences me when I'm at work, but also the Musqueam worldviews that I'm learning or that they're allowing me to learn that also influence me. So when I come to my work, I'm often engaged in, oh, I'm getting some echoing going on here. I'm often engaged in a lot of academia and in research because I work in an academic library. So I work at the Xwi7xwa Library at UBC, which is Canada's only Indigenous focused academic library. Our whole preface here at Xwi7xwa is to push against Western knowledge and to remain sovereign as an Indigenous focused library. Our library is built by, for, and with Indigenous people, specifically with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, but really putting that emphasis on Musqueam and our connection to Musqueam being on their lands. Here at Xwi7xwa, it's everything from our programming to the design of the building. We're an interior Salish kukuli. We're underground. We look like an interior Salish building. To our policies and protocols around our collection and things like using Brian deer. So being able to kind of push back against Western knowledge and really assert our sovereignty as a branch here at UBC is important to us. And we only became a branch of UBC Libraries in 2005. Before that, we were our own entity. We started in 1970s and then became the building that we are now and the Xwi7xwa that most people know now in about 1993 is when our building opened. So we've been open for 30 years. We just had our 30-year anniversary. Ooh. So why is it important for especially us at Xwi7xwa and for myself to assert sovereignty? And really what it is Western knowledge and the impact of research and Western knowledge has done a lot of damage to Indigenous communities and other communities. Often in educational institutions guided by things like Western bias, transform the plurality of knowledge systems into hierarchies of knowledge. Indigenous systems of knowledge and knowledge transmission were often deemed to be inferior compared to Western traditions. Western research is constituted by sets of ideas, practices, and privileges that are embedded within imperial expansion and colonialism. These ideas, practices, and privileges later became institutionalized by academic disciplines, schools, curriculum, universities. And under the control of intellectual heritage, Western thought often devalued and misinterpreted Indigenous knowledges. When we're thinking about research, the research really does put researchers in an arbitrary position of power, and it gives individuals authority over the discipline that they specialize in, even if they're not from that community. So when we're thinking about non-Indigenous researchers going out and researching with communities like Musqueam that are not from that community, they often don't have the worldview that folks from Musqueam, or they don't have the privilege to be engaging with all knowledges from Musqueam. It takes individuals and puts them in power when they shouldn't be necessarily in power within a community structure. So when I'm talking about Indigenous knowledges, it's really important that we start thinking and expanding on what exactly I'm talking about when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges. And I'll say it quite often during this presentation. So Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous peoples and communities do not focus necessarily their knowledge systems in binaries like Western education does. The world is very subjective, and in general, there's about 5 characteristics of Indigenous ways of knowing. So Indigenous knowledges can be very personal, orally transmitted with exception, experiential. So even the name Xwi7xwa, so the name of our branch, is an experiential name. And it's taken a lot of learning, even for me, to understand why our name is what we are. So Xwi7xwa, it means echo in Squamish Snitchum or in Hunkaminam. It's depending on how you say it, it's a linguistic thing. So in Squamish Snitchum, it's Xwi7xwa, and in Hunkaminam, so at Musqueam, it's Xwi7xwa. We use Xwi7xwa because we're on Musqueam territory. So the name is to echo, but when we're thinking about Xwi7xwa, it's not necessarily to echo like you would hear in like in a building. It's more like if you close your eyes and think about it, or if you experience, it's like going out to a beach and looking out over the water, or you're in a forest, a dense forest, and the fog's rolling in, or the fog's rolling in over the river. And you stand there and it's completely quiet and you're by yourself and you say something into the fog and the fog echoes it back to you. So there is a very experiential aspect even to our name. Unless you've been there and you've been in that situation where you're looking out over the ocean, you don't really have that experience to know exactly what I'm talking about. You can kind of imagine it, but you haven't experienced. So there's an experiential aspect to Indigenous knowledges and learning. It's holistic, so it expands against many different disciplines, and also narrative as well. I always say I'm a horrible storyteller. People tell me differently all the time. So additionally, Indigenous knowledges are also experienced and transmitted intergenerationally with kin, community, and often through ceremony. Not always, but often there is some type of ceremonial aspect to knowledge transmission within communities. And when we're talking about types of Indigenous knowledges, we can even break them down further. And really, when we're breaking them down, it helps us to understand knowledge protections and protocols. So the first types of knowledge that we have are traditional knowledges. So these are know-how, skills, practices that are developed and sustained from generation to generation within a community and often forms part of that community's cultural and spiritual identity. However, there is really no universally accepted definition of what traditional knowledges are. And then we have cultural expressions. Cultural expressions often involve traditional knowledges in them, but they're the more physical or tangible item. So cultural expressions are easier to protect under things like Canadian copyright law. So cultural expressions could be things like songs, button blankets. So here on the coast, people have button blankets. It could be teepee designs. It could be baskets, anything like that. So something that's easier to protect under copyright law. But the traditional knowledges that come into those cultural expressions are not easy to protect under copyright law. The expression is, but the knowledge behind the ceremonial aspect and the knowledges behind the cultural expression are not as easy to protect. And then we have genetic and biocultural resources. So there's a lot of work coming out of Aotearoa or New Zealand on the protection of genetic and biocultural resources by Indigenous communities, especially from things like big pharma. So these can be things like plant varieties, blood samples, things like that. So more of the science aspect of it. And when we bring all of it together, it informs what Indigenous data is. And I talk a lot about Indigenous data, but Indigenous data really is kind of a blanket term. So Indigenous data can be things like data on Indigenous resources and environments, so land history, geological information, titles, water information, data about Indigenous demographics or social data. So this can be legal, health, education, and often includes also community produced data. So things like census, so census records. And then we have things like data from Indigenous communities. So this are more looking at data that's like traditional stories, cultural data, archival, oral traditions, that should be recorded oral traditions, ancestral knowledge, and community stories. So when we take all of this together, we really are seeing, especially since about the 1970s, 1980s, a resurgence in and a revival. I shouldn't say a resurgence. We're seeing the uplift of Indigenous research. We're seeing more and more Indigenous people becoming engaged in academia, communities wanting to be involved in research projects, and more of kind of the assertion of sovereignty over research. However, there still are, in many cases, problems with and continuing problems with research. So the majority, because there is still a lack of, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous students entering into post-secondary, there still is the majority of Indigenous focused research being conducted by non-Indigenous peoples. Researchers often tend to select subjects or projects based on personal interest, which leads to Indigenous communities being inundated with research requests that don't always benefit the community in a direct way, or leads to irrelevant research and data outputs. We still see lack of informed consent due to language barriers, research not being returned to communities or disseminated in languages of communities, and then also the continued utmost disrespect and disregard for non-Indigenous researchers when it comes to traditional knowledges, stories, ceremonies, and also ancestral remains. But with Indigenous research and with Indigenous peoples guiding the way, there is this transformative shift that's starting to happen. And I've seen it a lot in the areas that I liaise with. So here at Xwi7xwa, I liaise with forestry and applied sciences. And we're seeing this shift where, researchers are becoming more engaged with community. They're having conversations about what benefits community. They're letting community members guide the way. And now there are folks who are in forestry and applied sciences that are from local Indigenous communities or are Indigenous researchers that are guiding the way on how we can do better in different disciplines. So Indigenous research, unlike Western research, emerges from the incorporation of Indigenous lived experiences, languages, and worldviews into the research process and centers Indigenous peoples and communities as the researcher and the primary authority on specific subjects and topics as well. Indigenous research is accountable, reciprocal, and it also integrates the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects of knowledge gathering and sharing with one another. As well, Indigenous research methodologies follow the same trajectory as Indigenous methods, and they dismiss colonial understandings of the research process and incorporate the use of techniques and methods drawn from traditions and knowledges of those people. So some of the ones that we've seen that have come from Indigenous researchers for the coast are things like potlatch as pedagogy, thinking about methods like the heartberry method from Alberta, thinking about the wild rose method, which is one that I came up with that talks about the 6 R's of Indigenous OER. But instead of just thinking of it as R's or as letters, so the 6 R's, thinking of it more as something that makes sense. So for me, when thinking about knowledge, I thought of a rose, so a wild rose. We have the sacred at the center of the rose. So reverence is at the center. And then we have respect on the petals, relationships, responsibility, etc., going around. And then reflection is the petals and the branches that come out for it. I chose a rose when thinking about this research method and a wild rose because they grow across what's now known as Canada, so Turtle Island. We have roses from west to east, north to south, because roses grow into also the subalpine. Additionally, for me as an Indigenous person, it just showed the resiliency. Roses are resilient, they grow and they expand, which is a lot like our knowledges. Us as Indigenous people are resilient, our knowledges are resilient. So the rose made sense. So I think that's the one thing about Indigenous research that's so enlightening. And this is something that I learned from one of my former professors, Dr. Chris Anderson from the University of Alberta. He told me that Indigenous studies is so important because it takes seemingly easy to understand concepts and complexifies them. So they get more complex, and we need to make things more complex. We need to break things down and ask questions and think differently about things. So that's why Indigenous studies, kind of focusing more on Indigenous research, is so important. So Indigenous research methods. So when we're talking about Indigenous research methods, and I talked a little bit about the one that I created and have been working on kind of making a little bit more nuanced. So Indigenous research methods are by and for Indigenous people. They use techniques that draw from traditions of those people. Right. So in general, when we're thinking about them, it's the recognition of the colonial past of Indigenous people, resistance of colonial narratives, resurgence of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. It prevents the insider-outsider aspect of research. It prevents research extraction or extractive research on communities, allows for Indigenous self-determination, and combats powers of traditional research practices. And really importantly, it brings in the concept of Indigenous relationality and really focuses on Indigenous relations. So when we're thinking about the Western hierarchy of research, it puts humans on the top of the period and forces all life to serve humans. Indigenous relationality breaks down that structure. Relationality for Indigenous people is at our core. It is how we connect to human and more human relations and is embedded in Indigenous knowledge systems and laws. Relationality is grounded in the holistic conception of the interconnectedness of all things on Earth. It forms social connectedness and brings to awareness the relationship of the world that we inhabit. Relationality also has the ability to transcend the physical and spiritual world and connects us with our ancestors, the creator, and those who are not born yet. So for me, even when I'm in the library practicing relationality, it's not just my connection to the land, my connection to the water, my connection to the mountains, my connection to my coworkers who are part of the human land. It's my connection and deep connection to my ancestors. It's my deep connection to also, and I always like, when I'm thinking about the libraries, we have deep connections with sometimes items that are in our libraries. I know Xwi7xwa, who's an archaeologist and practices heart learning in archaeology. She has a deep connection with some beads that she found on an archaeological site, and she sees those as a relation. So for me, even thinking about going further with some of the research that I'm doing, I'm trying to piece together how archives can be a relation. How can an archival faun, because it connects with humans and with people, how can an archival faun be seen and those physical pieces of paper being seen as a relation? And how do I work ethically with these items, given that they now have a more, relational sense to them? We're connected emotionally to items. So that's a little bit of the things that I've been thinking about, is like, how do you bring in relationality into things like archives and with physical library books as well? Additionally, we bring in sovereignty. Sovereignty is hugely important to Indigenous people, especially, globally with Indigenous people. Sovereignty is hugely important. And a lot of, like I said, at Xwi7xwa, we even have in our agreement with UBC libraries that we have an aspect of sovereignty within our branch to make decisions about our branch financially with our collection. So our collection policy is different than UBC's collection policy, because we have a collections policy for the branch that's actually focused more on that relational aspect and thinking about local first. So collecting Musqueam resources with permission of Musqueam and then branching outwards. So that is how we think about kin. And even when it comes to our Brian Deere classification system, that's all about sovereignty, being able to put kin together on the shelf, getting away with terminology that LOC has that does not actually reflect Indigenous communities. So sovereignty is hugely important in the whole aspect of librarianship. So within Canada specifically, and a lot of the time when I'm talking about sovereignty, copyright law, things like that, it very much so is within a Canadian understanding. As I know, there is international laws, things like that, but a lot of what I do talks about more of the Canadian aspect of it. So within Canada, the government of Canada does recognize that Indigenous people, so that's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, have the right to self-governance and self-determination. And this is guaranteed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. So the recognition of inherent right is based on the view that Indigenous people within Canada have the right to govern themselves in relations to matters that are internal to their communities, integral to their unique cultures, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions, and with respect to their special relationship to the land and resources. However, Western laws do often compete and violate Indigenous sovereignty here in Canada. We've seen this with things like land rights, linguistic rights, things like that. So especially when we compare Canadian laws that dictate ownership over knowledge, such as the Copyright Act, it is clear that Indigenous aspirations for self-governance under these laws compete with one another. And I've kind of alluded to that when I was talking about cultural expressions. So issues, especially here in Canada, around the protection of Indigenous knowledges, specifically traditional knowledges, arise due to TK or traditional knowledge not qualifying for protection under Canadian copyright law because they're too old and therefore supposedly within the public domain. There is no author of the material that is able to be identified, and so there's no rights holder in the traditional sense of the term of a rights holder under Canadian copyright law. Traditional knowledges are owned collectively by communities for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic claims. So these are kind of some of the things that when we're examining the Copyright Act or challenging the Copyright Act for the protection of Indigenous knowledges that hold up in Canadian court when it comes to why knowledges are not being protected as they should. And in many cases, the Copyright Act has allowed for the legalized theft of Indigenous knowledges through the guise of Western understandings of ownership and intellectual property. Well, one of the things that's important to note too, on especially even if there is a slight protection, Indigenous knowledge transfer is very different from Western knowledge transfer. So for Indigenous peoples, traditionally, knowledge is not necessarily freely given. It is earned. The tradition of knowledge can be informed, transmissions of knowledge can be informed by Indigenous legal traditions and strict protocols. These protocols vary from community to community, are generally formed by these following factors. So by kin or clan relationships, some kin and some clans own stories, and only those communities and those clans can tell those stories. It can be gender specific. There's stories that only women are allowed to carry, or only men are allowed to carry, or those who are also in between. Age specific, geographically influenced. So often we say that stories are tied to the land that they come from. And seasonal. Seasonal is probably the biggest one that I see when it comes to the transfer of knowledge. So there are stories that are not allowed to be told until it's winter time or there's snow on the ground. We're entering into the storytelling months right now, especially here on the coast. The winter is the storytelling months, and those stories and those ceremonies and stories that are told in ceremony are being emerged right now within the longhouse, within communities talking. There are even words that we're not allowed to say until the snow hits the ground. I know it snowed today in Alberta in Treaty 6, where I'm from. So even Xwi7xwa stories, I can say that now because I know it's snowing back home, and we're about to get maybe some snow up in the mountains in Vancouver. But Xwi7xwa stories, you can't even say which Xwi7xwa necessarily or tell those stories until the snow hits the ground. And then also informed by seasonal techniques and modes of production, or specific techniques and modes of production as well. So there's a lot of different protocols that are not necessarily like when I go to class at university, the professor sits there, tells me everything that I need to know, and then I somehow, whether it's an exam, a paper, things like that, I kind of regurgitate what they've taught me so that I can understand that I know that story. But that's not, or that teaching from that professor, but that's not the way that Indigenous education and knowledge transfer works. And there's times when elders will even tell us, I heard recently a story that I'm allowed to share. So it's not a story, but more of an experience that one of my friends had where they were traveling with an elder in the car, and the elder pointed at a flower that was growing on the side of the road and said, "This is what this flower is called." And then my friend asked, "Oh, well, what is it used for?" Just curious, like what medicines can it be used for, etc. And the elder said in that moment that they were telling them, not teaching them, because it wasn't the appropriate time for my friend to learn about the medicinal value. Being in the car and not in ceremony, not offering protocols. So some protocols that often get offered when knowledge sharing is sometimes monetary, sometimes flags, medicines, things like that. You have to offer some type of offering to be able to learn from an elder or a community member. So knowledge is just not freely given. It can take a really long time. Our drum stories in Treaty 6 territory can take months to learn. Why the world cycles within seasons, that is a multi-year teaching from an elder. So it takes a really long time, and there's protocol involved. Not all of our knowledges are sacred, not all of our stories are sacred, but we definitely have them. So When we're thinking about how we can advocate better for the protection of Indigenous knowledges, or how we can understand a little bit better about how sovereignty is informed with storytelling and data, we look at the concept of data sovereignty. So the concept of data sovereignty really is unique to the 21st century. It was caused or came about due to the increased availability of data online with the advent of the internet. The term data sovereignty simply implies the means by which managing information is consistent with laws, practices, and customs of the nation state for which that data is located. So for Indigenous people, we look at Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous data sovereignty centers Indigenous people's collective rights to data about people, territories, lifeways, cultural heritage, and natural resources. It's supported by Indigenous people's inherent right to self-determination and governance. So Indigenous data sovereignty puts forward the three following principles. Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance over data about them, regardless of where it is held and who holds that data. Indigenous nations have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own data protocols, as we've kind of talked before, and laws. And Indigenous peoples have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding. So this can be including things like access to government documents, archival documents, things like that. And Indigenous data sovereignty allows for us to seek and to protect cultural sovereignty of communities. So cultural sovereignty is essential for the survival of Indigenous nations' culture. And this includes languages, songs, oral histories, stories, dress, ceremonies, etc., as well as the land and communities that are at the core of Indigenous identities and ways of life. Indigenous sovereignty is threatened when cultural sovereignty is violated through exploitation, theft, and misrepresentation of Indigenous cultures, especially through things like qualitative data. So where do libraries fit into this? I've talked a little bit about it. I've talked about Xwi7xwa and our sovereignty, but libraries really do fit into being able to advocate. I think our profession is really great for being able to advocate, especially for communities that we're building relationships, or communities that we already have really great relationships with, like us with Musqueam. But there's a lot that we still can do. The whole area of Indigenous sovereignty within libraries, thinking differently about our policies and practices with Indigenous communities, is very new. And even when I talk about data sovereignty or how this exactly plays out in a large system, not at Xwi7xwa because we're so small, we can kind of do our own thing, but in larger systems like UBC Library, Vancouver Public, other places, even on a national level, we are just growing. We're just starting to have these conversations. So when thinking about libraries really play a huge role. We've made a lot of mistakes, and we're going to continue to make a lot of mistakes in our kind of journey towards reconciling with communities, to indigenizing our collection, to decolonizing our practices. And it's okay to make mistakes. I think we learn from our mistakes. Making mistakes can hurt, and it really is scary a lot of times. But when we're being corrected, so when I'm being corrected by elders, by my aunties, by my community members, they're correcting me in my behavior or in something that I've done, not to harm me, but so that I can learn and I can do better. So making mistakes is a good thing so that we can learn. So this is just a statement of apology from the president of UBC that was put out in 2018 to Indigenous communities to say, we're really sorry about some of the very harmful research that's been done, some of the problematic practices that have been done with communities over since the advent of the university, and that we want to do better. Especially here at UBC, we have an Indigenous strategic plan that addresses some of the mistakes that have been made in the past and looks to doing forward better relationships, better research with communities and supporting communities, as well as we have the Inclusion Action Plan that also not just looks at Indigenous communities, but other communities who we don't have good relations with at the university. So libraries, I mean, we can look at the past of libraries, the mistakes that have been made. We can kind of comb through them. I used to teach at the University of Alberta in the library school, and I'd have students look at historic texts and journal articles that would be created or that have been created that talk about Indigenous people, that talk about really problematic ways of viewing communities. And it's not to kind of point the finger and be like, look at how bad. It's more to be like, where are we moving forward from this? Is there things that we're still doing that is problematic with communities? So a lot of the things, instead of like we here at Xwi7xwa practice Indigenous librarianship, which very much is by, for, with. There is in some cases still library systems or librarians that is more of the mindset that I'm a librarian. I'm going to tell you how to do things instead of working with Indigenous communities. So that by, for, with. I always like to say nothing about us without us. So really bringing in community voices, looking at the services that we have for communities, looking at how we reduce barriers to access for communities instead of continuing to perpetrate harmful practices, harmful terminology, etc. And there's another one. This one's a little bit more. It's really problematic. It is from the time when we still had corporal punishment in schools. So we definitely don't have that anymore. And we've moved past that. But just like thinking about, what harmful things were done before, but where are we now? What can we celebrate and what can we do better? So like I said, Indigenous librarianship can be practiced not just by Indigenous people, but by non-Indigenous people too. And Indigenous librarianship really, especially when working with communities, is the way forward for most people, or thinking about practicing Indigenous librarianship. So what it is it unites the discipline of librarianship with Indigenous knowledge, the approaches to Indigenous knowledges, theory, and research methodology. It has really, it is developing on a national, local, and international scale. And like I said before, Indigenous librarianship is culturally relevant library and information services by, for, and with Indigenous people. It's grounded in the contemporary realities of Indigenous folks and our aspiration for self-governance and sovereignty. There's sovereignty again, and law and governance. So it really is, especially when working with Indigenous people, it is something to explore. And there's a few journal articles that break down Indigenous librarianship and what it is a lot better than my two little bullet points here. So there's lots to learn about kind of this sub-discipline of librarianship. And then also we can take it not only from our physical collection. So thinking about how Indigenous librarianship fits into our physical collections and our protocols and our policies and programs that we have in our physical spaces like Xwi7xwa or other libraries. But how does it move into things like digital spaces? Now that libraries are becoming so focused on online and digital collections, e-preferred. I know UBC is going e-preferred. So thinking about how sovereignty works within those types of spaces. So in digital spaces, it's about rethinking our actions, how not everything is meant to go online. And that kind of follows that Indigenous data sovereignty. Not all photos and items, so even pictures of ceremonial items, are meant to go online. We can think of digital spaces as land or territory and apply the protocols that exist within them. Look for best practices and community-oriented examples around sovereignty in digital spaces. Thinking about dark storage and digital repatriation. So digital repatriation is different. I define it differently than like museums do. So digital repatriation in a museum would be, or in the museum context, is that they would take a photo of, say, something like a Hamatsa mask, and then they would send the photo to the community so that they have that digital copy of it, but they would still keep the mask. So for me, it's I think of digital repatriation more when it comes to like photograph collections that we have in things like Circle at UBC or ERA. So photographs that maybe communities don't want shown, very ethnographic photographs or photographs of ceremonial sites, graveyards, of ceremonial practices, and returning those photos to communities. Because a lot of times communities are still revitalizing their cultural practice and they want these photos. They just don't want them shared with everybody. So how do we kind of repatriate those collections or put them in dark storage if communities don't have the capacity to have servers and online archives, things like that? How do we put things in dark storage and have tiered access for communities to be able to access materials or not access, or kind of delegate the access of that? And then sovereignty in the stack. So working with community to develop plans to review specific collections and items, being transparent and honest. I have to do that on a daily basis with communities. We have a lot of things in our collection that we're not supposed to have, things that are not supposed to be shown to people. We've been collecting since the 70s. We have a backlog of cataloging still from the 1970s that needs to be done. So we are constantly talking to communities, especially when it comes to items that we just feel, I like to say we feel icky about having. We recently discovered in a box a bunch of not necessarily brochures, but it's almost like a catalog of Indigenous children that were up for adoption in the 1960s and 70s. And it's a catalog with faces, where they're from, disabilities, religion, and it was for children to be adopted out of their community. So for us at Xwi7xwa, we don't feel like we're the best place to have these items. Not only because they're very sensitive items, there's lots of work being done around the 60s scoop. So we're just not the best place for it. There's better places for it. So we are being transparent with, the university, saying why we're not the best place for this. And then we're consulting with folks like at the NCTR, so the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, for them to then steward this information, because we don't feel like we should be doing that. Planning for pushback. We get pushback all the time on what we're doing, why we do things. But we just kind of assert our sovereignty. And being creative. We're creative all the time about how we kind of deal with that pushback, how we organize our stacks, how we work with communities, how we support communities, and really try and redefine how librarianship is practiced with communities. So data sovereignty supports. I know I told you I'd show you some toolkits, some websites, things like that. There's lots of information now out there on sovereignty for Indigenous communities when it comes to knowledge and libraries. There are national, now we have NICLA, which is the National Indigenous Knowledges Language organization, and it spans across Canada. And it's made up of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. It's led by Camille Callison and Stacey Allison Casson. And it's in place so that we can start talking about some of the problems that we're having when it comes to metadata, when it comes to the protection of Indigenous knowledges. It is an organization of folks that are coming together in Canada, trying to think about how we can do better. Then we have GITA. GITA is an organization that I've worked with to give some presentations. But what GITA is that they're the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And so there was Canadian representation from the States, from all over the place, of Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies when it comes to data sovereignty. And they came up with the CARE and FAIR principles. So FAIR is the principles for open access, that's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and reusable, that's it. So that's the FAIR principles, but FAIR doesn't work with Indigenous knowledges. So they also came up with CARE. So the little saying that they have is be fair and care. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics. So we have the FAIR principle, and then we throw on CARE to make it more ethical and align with Indigenous governance structures when working with Indigenous knowledges and data. And then OCAP. So OCAP is training that anyone can take. OCAP is run by the First Nations Information Governance Connect. And OCAP are principles that stand for ownership, control, access, and possession. And I believe if you want to take OCAP training, it's through Mohawk College. And it's an online course that you can take that talks all about Indigenous data sovereignty, the OCAP principles, and brings in some real life examples of how ownership, control, access, and possession of Indigenous data has been enacted in different communities, and how that control has been taken back, how that ownership and access to information looks different. And they also have the Indigenous, what is it called? It is the data, it's their data service that they have. And the data service allows for Indigenous communities to delegate who gets access to different research collections about those communities. So FNIGC also has not just the training, but they have an actual like research service for Indigenous communities to be able to use. So I wanted just to show very quick what some of these things are. So this is more about GITA. You can read up about what exactly they do, how they're advancing Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, but also they do post a lot of times if some of their members, so Maui Hudson is doing a lot with DNA and with those biocultural and genetic resources. So they post a lot of their, especially for, you know, continued learning, their talks that their members are giving about Indigenous data sovereignty, about cultural sovereignty, things like that. And it is on that global level. So not just Canada, learning from other folks on what they're doing. And then from there, we also have, this is the OCAP website, and I can share these links also with folks. So OCAP, more information about them, more information about, so education and training, their First Nations governance strategy, research, and then the First Nations Data Center. So this is that research repository that I was talking about. So if you want to access data that is held in this repository, you have to make a request to a community member. So that's very different compared to lots of data repositories. And then OCAP, so the training, so the fundamentals of OCAP training, how you sign up for it, a bit more information about OCAP and what it is. And I think the course, last time I took it, it cost about $300 to take OCAP training, but they just revamped the course because I believe it's been almost 20 years since OCAP was developed, or First Nations Information Government Connect was developed. So they've revamped their training, and I heard it's amazing. I took the old training, which was equally amazing and enlightening, but I heard the new one's very good. And then I just wanted to share this. So this is digital scowlets. So in talking about community controlled collections, this is a really great example of how communities have been able to work with researchers to create their own online community museums, archives that follow those kind of Indigenous data sovereignty principles. So here you'll see these little things. These are traditional knowledge labels, and they come from the organization local context. So there's a lot of information about local context and what they do, but they have created, which almost are like Creative Commons licenses or labels. The traditional knowledge labels are for communities to use. So that's why Digital Scowlets has it. And the TK labels are kind of along the lines of a Creative Commons, but they have like provenance labels, so traditional knowledge that has to do with clan, family, community voice, things like that. Protocol labels, so seasonal, so like I was saying about wintertime. So you would use these on a digital collection to identify either to other community members or people that are not from that community, what are exactly the protocols that need to be followed when engaging with the information on the website. So as we can see here in Digital Scowlets, they've even defined within their own understanding of that community and within their own language what this looks like. So here's a traditional knowledge label for outreach. And this is how you'd say it in their language. And this is what it means. So education and teachings. And then they have an example of, you know, what exactly they mean by this label or how they're using this label. So even here you can say, we ask that outsiders respect our culture by not using the content out of context. If you use the content on this website, please be respectful, and encourages folks to connect with the band, to create more opportunities for working together. So these are some of these ways in which, and I know Jane Anderson, the person who works with, is the creator of the traditional knowledge labels and local context, worked with the Scowlets community to help to build this out and have it so that it's way more community focused than it used to be. In addition, because these TK labels are very much so for community, they have created now for folks like us here at Xwi7xwa notices. So notices can be stuff like collections care, engagement, disclosure, things like that. So these are more for institutions to use. So for libraries to use, we can use these, museums can use these, but we can't use the labels. Those are for communities to use. We can also become members. So Xwi7xwa and myself are members. So our library is a member of their Knowledge Hub. And then myself as a researcher is a member of the Knowledge Hub as well. And they are continuously growing the local context website to include more resources, more continued learning things for folks. So I'll go back to my slides just so that you can see my contact, but we are coming up to the end of time for today with us being here today, not completely the end of time. But there is a little bit more information about Xwi7xwa Library. If you follow this link, you'll be able to see more information about our branch, photos, our social medias, things like that. And then also my contact here at UBC and my Twitter. So my Twitter is anti-librarian. And I post occasionally. I post more things that have to do with the branch than anything. And I'll stop sharing because I can take some questions. And I hope you enjoyed the talk and are going to follow some of those links and learn more about the different resources that are out there to learn about.